Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of 1986. Imagine the streets of South London as the world prepares for sleep. The air is cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and the early blossoms of April. It is a time of transition, where the heavy coats of winter are just beginning to be tucked away. But in the quiet corners of Wandsworth and Stockwell, a different kind of winter was beginning to settle, a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Tonight, we begin our journey into the mystery of Kenneth Erskine, a name that would soon haunt the city, but in these early spring nights, he was merely a shadow, unnoticed and unnamed. Close your eyes, settle into your pillows, and let the rhythm of the city carry you back in time. The neighborhood of Stockwell in the 1980s was a tapestry of brick and history. Grand Victorian houses stood side by side with modern housing estates, creating a landscape of narrow alleys and sudden, open squares. At night, the orange glow of the street lamps cast long, distorted shadows against the soot-stained walls. There was a rhythm to the evening here, the distant clatter of a train, the muffled sound of a television from behind a thick curtain, the rhythmic ticking of a radiator cooling down as the midnight air pressed against the glass. It was a place where many elderly residents had lived for decades, finding comfort in the solid weight of their front doors and the familiar sounds of their neighbors moving about. But the air in April 1986 felt different, though no one could quite say why until it was far too late. In a basement flat at number 81 West Hill Road, a woman named Eileen Ems lived a life of quiet routine. At 78 years old, Eileen was a retired school teacher, a woman who had spent her years nurturing young minds. Her home was a reflection of her gentle nature, filled with books, old photographs, and the soft fragrance of lavender. Imagine the basement flat, tucked slightly below the level of the sidewalk, where the light from the passing cars filtered through the curtains at a sharp angle. The rooms were filled with the textures of a long and meaningful life. Lace doilies on the dark wood tables, a favorite velvet armchair that had softened over time, and the steady, comforting heartbeat of a grandfather clock. Eileen was a woman who valued her peace, a reclusive soul who moved through her days with a quiet, practiced grace. On a night in the first week of April, the silence in that basement flat became absolute. Outside, the world continued its indifferent pace. Perhaps a car splashed through a puddle on the road above, or a stray cat slunk across the garden wall. But inside, the sanctuary had been breached. A phantom had entered the rooms. There was no sound of breaking glass, no splintering of wood to alert the sleeping neighbors. The intruder moved with a terrifying fluidity, slipping through the shadows like a ghost of pure malice. In the stillness of the bedroom, the air seemed to grow heavy. The violence that followed was swift and silent, a dark contrast to the peaceful surroundings. When the shadow eventually left, the room was returned to its stillness, but the peace was gone forever. Eileen was left in her bed, the covers pulled up to her chin as if she were merely resting, waiting for a morning she would never see. The morning of April 9th, 1986, brought with it a pale, hazy London sun. When the home help arrived for her weekly visit, the silence of the flat felt heavy and strange. She let herself in, calling out a greeting that vanished into the quiet air. As she moved toward the bedroom, there was no sign of a struggle. Everything seemed to be in its proper place. Eileen lay in her bed, her face calm, appearing to have passed away peacefully in her sleep. The doctor who was called to the scene saw a woman of 78 years and assumed the natural conclusion. He recorded a verdict of natural causes, believing that Eileen had simply drifted away 3 days earlier. It was a tragedy, certainly, but one that seemed to belong to the natural order of things. But as the home help began the somber task of tidying the flat, her eyes drifted to the space where the television had always sat. The portable set was gone. It was a small detail, but in the oppressive quiet of that basement, it was a scream. Why would a woman who died peacefully in her sleep have a missing television? The suspicion began as a small flicker of unease before growing into a cold, sharp dread. The police were called back, and the scene was re-examined with a new, professional focus. They looked closer at the windows and the frames, finding no obvious signs of a break-in, but the missing object suggested a presence that did not belong. The order was given for a post-mortem, a decision that would strip away the illusion of a peaceful passing and reveal a truth that would terrify the community. The medical examiners found what the initial inspection had completely missed. There were finger marks around Eileen's throat and bruising that spoke of a brutal struggle. Her ribs had been cracked, the result of a heavy weight kneeling upon her chest. Most horrifyingly, the examination revealed that she had been sexually assaulted. The realization hit the investigators like a physical blow. This was not a natural death, nor was it a simple burglary. A predator was moving through the streets of South London, someone who targeted the most vulnerable and left them in a pose of deceptive peace. There were no fingerprints left behind, no stray hairs to point the way. The killer was a void, a shadow that had vanished into the April mist, leaving the police with a mounting sense of urgency and a complete lack of clues. The silence of April was no longer peaceful. It was the silence of a hunter, waiting for the next opportunity. The revelation from Eileen's autopsy had sent a cold shiver through the precinct. But in the chaotic rhythm of London life, the significance of those bruises was still being processed. The spring of 1986 was slowly giving way to a summer that would become legendary for its stifling, oppressive heat. As June arrived, the city began to bake under a relentless sun, and in the residential blocks of Stockwell and Wandsworth, the elderly residents did what anyone would do to find relief. They propped open their heavy sash windows, inviting the evening breeze to drift through their small apartments. They didn't know that they were also inviting a shadow. The marks found on Eileen's throat had been a quiet warning, a whisper of violence that the authorities were only just beginning to hear. But it would take another tragedy, another silent room, for that whisper to become a scream. Catherine G. was a woman who cherished her independence and the quiet comfort of her home. In the early weeks of June, she lived her life with the same gentle routine she had followed for years. Her neighbors saw her as a fixture of the community, a kind soul who moved through the world with a grace that masked her vulnerability. But as the temperature climbed and the nights grew thick with humidity, Catherine, like so many others, left her window slightly ajar to let in the night air. It was a simple act of survival against the heat, yet it provided the narrowest of opportunities for a predator who moved with the agility of a ghost. In the dark hours of a June night, the second shadow fell. There was no sound of a struggle, no shattered glass, and no cry for help that reached the street below. The world continued to sleep, unaware that the pattern was beginning to solidify. When Catherine was discovered, the scene was hauntingly familiar to those who had stood in Eileen's basement flat just 2 months prior. She was lying in her bed, her eyes closed as if she were merely lost in a deep, dreamless slumber. The most striking detail, however, was the bedding. The sheets and blankets had been pulled up with meticulous care, tucked tightly under her chin, smoothing over the violence that had occurred beneath them. It was a macabre imitation of a caregiver's touch, a final gesture of order from a man who brought only chaos. This tucking in would eventually become the signature of the Stockwell Strangler, a psychological tic that suggested a deeply disturbed mind. To the first responders, it looked like a natural passing, a peaceful end to a long life. But the detectives who arrived later, their minds already primed by the strange findings in Wandsworth, felt a mounting sense of dread as they pulled back the linens. The physical evidence was subtle but devastating. Just like Eileen, Catherine bore the faint, darkening imprints of a single hand around her throat. There was also the telltale bruising on her chest, the result of immense pressure as if someone had knelt upon her with their full weight while they extinguished her life. Forensic examiners noted the precision of the attack. It was swift, efficient, and horrifyingly intimate. They also found that, like the previous case, a small item of value was missing, not a large sum of money or expensive heirlooms, but a portable television set. This wasn't the work of a professional thief looking for a payday. This was someone who took what they wanted as an afterthought to the kill. As the sun set over London that evening, the medical examiner's report landed on the desk of senior investigators with the weight of a lead brick. The coincidence had vanished, replaced by a terrifying certainty. Inside the police incident room, a map of South London was pinned to the wall. 2 red circles now marked the spots where elderly women had been found dead in their beds, only a few miles apart. The realization began to dawn on the local police that they were not dealing with isolated incidents of misfortune, but with a serial predator. The term serial killer was still relatively rare in the public consciousness of 1980s Britain, but the detectives could feel the shift in the air. They began to cross-reference every report of natural deaths among the elderly from the past several months, looking for any mention of open windows or missing electronics. The atmosphere in the station grew heavy with the knowledge that while they were looking for a ghost, that ghost was likely already selecting his next target. The predator was moving through the estates with total anonymity, a shadow among shadows, blending into the very communities he was dismantling. By the time the news of Catherine's death began to circulate, a quiet fear had started to take root in the neighborhood. Word of mouth traveled faster than the morning papers, and elderly residents began to double-check their locks and pull their windows shut, despite the suffocating heat. The sense of security that had defined these close-knit communities was evaporating. Every creak of a floorboard and every rustle of the wind against a curtain became a source of terror. The police were now in a race against a clock they couldn't see, hunting a man they couldn't describe. The second shadow had fallen, and as the investigation deepened, they realized that the killer wasn't just lurking in the darkness. He was thriving in it, waiting for the next warm night and the next open window to strike again. The hunt for the Stockwell Strangler had officially begun, and the city held its breath as the sun dipped below the horizon once more. The air in South London during the mid-1980s carried a specific weight. It was a dense, humid summer, the kind that forced windows to stay propped open by a few inches, inviting any small breeze to stir the lace curtains. In the quiet blocks of sheltered housing and the rows of Victorian terraces in Stockwell, there lived a generation that remembered a different time. These were men and women in their 70s, 80s, and 90s, individuals who viewed their small flats not just as residences, but as hard-earned sanctuaries. They were the keepers of stories, the quiet observers of a changing city, and for many, their homes were the only places where they felt truly in control. But in 1986, their very age and the solitude they often lived in became a silent signal to a predator. The predator did not look for grand displays of wealth. He looked for the absence of resistance. He looked for the flickering blue light of a television set left on for company and the unlocked latch of a window that felt, to the resident, safely out of reach. The vulnerability of these residents was layered and profound. It was not merely a matter of physical frailty, though that played a cruel and calculated part in the selection process. It was a generational trust, a belief that a locked front door was a sufficient barrier against the world's sharper edges. Kenneth Erskine understood this better than most. He did not need a key to bypass a lock. He saw the very architecture of these buildings as a series of footholds. At 23 years old, he was an experienced burglar who moved with a terrifying, fluid grace that would eventually earn him comparisons to a cat. He looked at the brickwork of the Stockwell estates and saw a ladder. To him, a drain pipe was not a utility, but a path upward. A window left slightly ajar to let in the cooling night air of the heatwave was an invitation. He targeted those who were least likely to fight back, those whose voices might not carry far enough to alert a neighbor, turning their peaceful havens into sites of unspeakable intrusion. To imagine these crimes is to imagine the silence of those rooms before the shadows shifted. Picture the rhythmic, slow ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway, or the soft hum of an old refrigerator. The atmosphere was often defined by the familiar sense of a long life. Lavender sachets tucked into dresser drawers, the faint, lingering aroma of afternoon tea, and the smell of old paper from books that had been read and reread. Outside, the night sounds of London would hum, the distant hiss of a bus on the main road, the occasional bark of a dog streets away. Then, a new sound would emerge, one that did not belong to the neighborhood symphony. It was the soft scrape of rubber soles against brick, the low, rhythmic breathing of someone exerting themselves just outside the glass. Erskine would pull himself upward, his fingers finding purchase in the gaps between the old stones. He was agile and fueled by a dark, internal impulse that stood in jarring contrast to the stillness of the rooms he sought to enter. In many of the cases from that long summer, there were no signs of forced entry. This detail, perhaps more than any other, chilled the investigators and the community alike. It suggested a predator who could bypass the physical boundaries of a home without leaving a trace of his arrival until it was far too late. He would slip through the frame of a bathroom window or a kitchen skylight, his boots landing softly on the carpet, disturbing nothing. Once inside, the intruder became a ghost in the machine of their daily lives. He moved past the kitchenettes where porcelain cups sat drying on racks, and past the small dining tables where newspapers lay folded, ready for the morning. There is a specific horror in the thought of someone navigating the intimate geometry of a stranger's home while they sleep. Erskine would move through these spaces with a predatory focus, disregarding the sanctity of the lives lived within those walls. The choice of victims, including World War veterans and retired teachers, reflected a total lack of empathy. In one instance, he entered a residential home in Stockwell where two elderly men, one aged 84 and the other 94, were attacked in the supposed safety of their own beds. The sanctuary of the nursing home, designed to provide care and protection, was proven to be fragile. Erskine would often rearrange the bedclothes after his attacks, pulling the sheets up to the chins of his victims to make it appear as though they were merely sleeping. This final, domestic touch was a bizarre and cruel attempt to mask the violence, extending the illusion of a peaceful death for a few more hours. The fear that settled into the stones of Stockwell was not a loud, chaotic panic, but a cold, creeping realization that the very things that make a home a sanctuary, privacy, quiet, and comfort, had become the very things that made them targets. The summer of 1986 became a time where the walls no longer felt solid, and the night air brought only the threat of the shadows moving outside the glass. The summer of 1986 in London was not just defined by its stifling, heavy heat, but by a silence that felt increasingly brittle. In the south, particularly within the brick-lined streets of Stockwell and the neighboring boroughs, the humidity seemed to trap the breath of the city. The sun would hang low and orange over the Thames, and as the evening light faded, a different kind of stillness would settle. Usually, this was a season of open windows and the soft murmur of radios drifting through screen doors. But as July progressed, that rhythm broke. The air stayed thick, but the windows began to close, one by one. The community was retreating. In the small, tidy flats where the elderly lived, the heat became a secondary concern to the shadow that was moving through the night. Doors that had once been left on the latch were now secured with heavy bolts, and the sound of a turning key became the nightly lullaby of the vulnerable. By the first week of July, the police were no longer looking at isolated tragedies. They were looking at a predator. The realization had been slow and agonizingly subtle. For weeks, many of the deaths had been written off as the quiet, natural end of long lives. The elderly, after all, often passed away in their sleep. But when investigators began to look closer, the details began to scream. It wasn't just that these people were gone. It was the surreal, domestic order in which they were found. The killer had a signature that was as chilling as it was bizarre. After the violence, after the struggle was over, he would meticulously tuck his victims back into their beds. He would pull the heavy wool blankets up to their chins, smoothing the creases, ensuring they looked peaceful, as if they were merely resting. This act of grotesque care was a camouflage that delayed the discovery of the crimes, sometimes for days, allowing the killer to vanish back into the maze of South London's housing estates before the first scream was ever heard. On July 8, 1986, the terror crossed the river into Islington. William Carman, an 84-year-old man who lived on the Marquis estate, became the next focus of this dark energy. He was found by his daughter, a scene that would forever haunt the quiet corridors of that residential block. Inside the flat, there was a strange, heavy atmosphere. £300 had been taken, a small fortune to a pensioner, but the theft was almost an afterthought to the violence inflicted upon him. The police noticed something peculiar in William's home, a detail that suggested a deep, fractured psyche at work. Photographs of his family, usually displayed with pride, had been turned toward the wall. It was as if the killer could not bear to be watched by the frozen eyes of the living while he went about his grim business. This small, chilling detail added a layer of psychological complexity to the investigation. This was not a common thief. This was someone who felt a strange, distorted connection to the spaces he violated. As the news of the Islington murder filtered back to Stockwell, a dedicated task force was formally established. The pressure inside the police stations was as thick as the summer air outside. Detectives worked in shirt sleeves under whirring desk fans, surrounded by maps pinned with red markers. Each marker represented a life extinguished: Nancy Ems, Janet Cockett, Valentine Gleim, Zbigniew Stabrawa. The names were becoming a litany of the lost. They looked for common threads in the forensic evidence, but the killer was frustratingly elusive. He didn't use a weapon that could be traced. He used his hands. He didn't smash doors. He slipped through windows that were left ajar for a breeze. The task force began to realize they were hunting a ghost who knew the geography of the estates better than the patrols did. He was a drifter, someone who lived in the cracks of society, someone who could blend into the background of a bus stop or a park bench without drawing a single glance. The terror reached a fever pitch on July 21st. In a small bedsit in Stockwell, 74-year-old William Downes was found. His son had visited him just days before, specifically warning him to keep his windows locked because of the rumors circulating through the neighborhood. But in the stifling heat of a London July, a locked window can feel like a cage. Perhaps William just wanted a breath of air. He was found the next morning, tucked into his bed with that same terrifying precision. The sheets were pulled tight, his body arranged in a mockery of sleep. This time, however, the forensic teams found a breakthrough. A palm print was recovered from the kitchen wall, a smudge of identity left behind in the dark. It was a singular, physical link to the man the papers were now calling the Stockwell Strangler. But a print is only useful if you have a name to match it to, and the owner of that hand was still out there, moving through the shadows of the heatwave. The atmosphere in Stockwell changed from caution to a frantic, collective guarding. Hardware stores ran out of window locks and secondary bolts. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years began checking on one another every hour. There was a sense that the very air was poisoned. People looked at every stranger with suspicion. The man in the oversized coat, the youth lingering by the stairwell, the quiet figure at the Social Security office. The police patrols were doubled, their sirens cutting through the night, yet the killer seemed to move with an impossible impunity. He was a shadow that didn't just haunt the streets, but the very idea of home. For the elderly residents of South London, The sanctuary of their bedrooms had been transformed into a place of potential ambush. They sat in the dark, listening to the creaks of their houses, waiting for the morning light to prove they had survived another night in the summer of bolted doors. The night of July 8th, 1986, arrived with a stillness that felt almost artificial, as if the city of London were holding its collective breath. The midsummer heat had become a physical presence, a heavy, velvet weight that pressed against the window panes of the small flats and terraced houses in Stockwell. In the previous weeks, the neighborhood had transformed. The casual trust of a suburban evening had been replaced by the sharp, metallic click of newly installed bolts and the low hum of nervous conversation. But for those living within the quiet sanctuary of the residential home for the aged on Stockwell Park Crescent, the world still felt, for a few more hours, like a place of routine and rest. Inside the home, the corridors were dimly lit, smelling of floor wax and the faint, lingering scent of evening tea. It was a place designed for peace, housing those who had reached the twilight of their lives. Among them was Valentine Gleim, an 84-year-old man whose life had been defined by resilience. A veteran of the Second Great War, he had survived the chaos of international conflict only to seek the simple comfort of a small room and a soft bed in South London. He was a man of quiet habits, likely settling into sleep that night with the expectation that the walls around him were a fortress against the growing darkness outside. He could not have known that a shadow was already moving through the gardens, testing the latches of the ground-floor windows with a practiced, predatory patience. The intruder, Kenneth Erskine, found his entry through an unsecured window. There was no sound of breaking glass, no violent struggle that would alert the night staff. He slipped into the room like a ghost, his movements fueled by a terrifying and singular focus. The methodology was chillingly consistent. He did not use a weapon. He used the weight of his own body and the strength of his hands. He would kneel upon the chest of his victim, a heavy, suffocating pressure that rendered defense impossible. In the darkness of that small room, Valentine Gleim's long life was extinguished in a matter of moments. The killer then performed a ritual that would become his most haunting trademark. He pulled the bedsheets up to the victim's chin, neatly tucking them in as if the man were merely drifting through a peaceful dream. But the night was not yet over. In an escalation that would send shockwaves through the Metropolitan Police, the shadow did not retreat back into the London night. Instead, he moved to the very next room. This was the room of Zbigniew Strabawa, a 94-year-old man who, like his neighbor, had lived through the upheavals of the 20th century. The proximity of the two crimes was staggering. Within the same hour, in the same hallway, a second soul was claimed. The sheer audacity of the double murder suggested a killer who was no longer afraid of being caught, a predator who was beginning to revel in the absolute control he held over the vulnerable. The silence of the residential home remained unbroken, the other residents sleeping just feet away, oblivious to the fact that a monster was walking their floors. As the first light of dawn began to gray the edges of the curtains, the night attendant made her rounds. It was then that the true horror of July 8th was revealed. The discovery of two bodies in such quick succession changed the nature of the investigation instantly. This was no longer a series of isolated, tragic incidents. It was a focused, relentless campaign of terror. Forensic teams descended on Stockwell Park Crescent, their cameras flashing in the darkened rooms. They found the same lack of forced entry, the same precise positioning of the bodies, and the same terrifying absence of a motive beyond the act itself. The pressure on the detectives was now nearly unbearable. They were no longer looking for a common burglar. They were hunting a ghost who could enter a locked facility and vanish before the sun rose. The news of the double murder spread through Stockwell like a fever. The local shops, usually places of idle gossip, were now thick with a heavy, watchful silence. People looked at their neighbors with suspicion, wondering if the man they passed on the street could be the one who moved through windows in the dead of night. The police issued urgent warnings, pleading with the elderly to keep their windows closed despite the stifling summer heat. But for many, the damage was already done. The psychological toll of 2 lives taken in a single night had stripped away the last remnants of safety. As the investigation intensified, the shadow of the Stockwell Strangler loomed larger than ever, a dark presence waiting for the next time the sun would set over the city. The air in London during the summer of 1986 was thick, a heavy blanket of humidity that seemed to trap the city's anxieties within its brick and mortar. For the investigators of the Serious Crime Squad, the heat was more than just a discomfort. It was a ticking clock. Inside the quiet, unassuming homes of Stockwell and Wandsworth, a different kind of stillness had taken hold. It was the silence that follows a storm, a vacuum left behind by a predator who moved like a shadow through the night. As we enter this chapter of the investigation, the focus shifts from the chaos of the streets to the sterile, quiet world of the forensic laboratory, where the smallest speck of dust can speak louder than a scream. Imagine the scene inside one of these flats. The light from the street lamps filters through thin curtains, casting long, distorted shadows across the floral wallpaper. To the naked eye, the rooms appeared almost untouched, save for the tragic figure in the bed. But the forensic officers, the scene of crime specialists, knew that every surface held a hidden history. They moved with a slow, rhythmic grace, their white suits ghostly in the dim light. They were looking for entry points, and they found them at the windows. In almost every case, a window had been left slightly ajar to catch a breeze against the summer swelter. It was through these small, rectangular openings that the stranger had slipped, his movements as lithe as a cat's, climbing into the private sanctuaries of the vulnerable. In the flat of Janet Cockett, the team began the meticulous process of dusting. There is a specific sound to this work, the soft, repetitive scritch-scritch of a fine squirrel hair brush moving over wood and glass. They used aluminum powder, a fine, silver-gray dust that clings to the oils left behind by human skin. As the brush moved over a window sill, a shape began to emerge from the darkness. It wasn't a fingerprint, but something larger, more substantial. It was a palm print. It appeared as a pale, shimmering ghost against the frame, a map of ridges and valleys that belonged to a hand that should never have been there. This was the first true signature of the man. The press was now calling the Stockwell Strangler. The discovery was repeated at the home of William Downs. This time, the killer had been even less careful, or perhaps he was becoming arrogant. A clear palm print was lifted from a garden gate and another from a kitchen wall. In the world of forensics in 1986, this was gold. However, we must remember that this was an era before instant digital databases. There were no computer screens to flash a matching face within seconds. Instead, these prints had to be compared manually. Fingerprint experts spent hours, their eyes strained under magnifying loops, comparing the ridges of the newly found prints against thousands of paper records kept in the massive archives of Scotland Yard. It was a labor of patience, a search for a needle in a haystack made of ink and paper. As the forensic map grew, so did the physical evidence. Beyond the palm prints, investigators found shoe marks in the light layer of dust on the linoleum floors. These weren't just any marks. They were distinctive tread patterns that showed a specific type of wear. These same shoe prints were found at 3 separate crime scenes, and most crucially, they matched the marks left behind at the home of Fred Prentice, the brave soul who had fought back and survived. The evidence was weaving a web. The prints, the shoe marks, and even a single, stray hair found at the scene of Nancy M.'s murder were all beginning to point toward a single, terrifying truth. One man was responsible for this entire trail of sorrow. The profile that emerged from this evidence was chilling. The killer was clearly agile, able to scale walls and slip through high windows with ease. He was a creature of habit, kneeling on the chests of his victims to pin them down, using his left hand to silence them while his right hand did the terrible work of the strangler. There was a sickening intimacy to his method, a calculated cruelty that suggested he enjoyed the power he held over the frail and the elderly. The police now had a physical profile, and soon, thanks to those palm prints, they would have a name. But a name is just a word until you find the man it belongs to. And Kenneth Erskine was a ghost, a drifter who lived in the cracks of the city, moving between squats and social security offices, always one step ahead of the light. The investigation was now a fever pitch of activity. The palm prints had been matched to a young man with a history of burglary, a 24-year-old drifter. The detectives knew who they were looking for, but the streets of South London were vast and unforgiving. Every alleyway, every abandoned building, and every crowded benefit office was a potential hiding place. The traces in the dust had given them a target, but the hunt was only just beginning. As the sun set on another day in 1986, the city held its breath, waiting to see if the man with the silver-gray palms would be caught before he could find another open window in the dark. The name Kenneth Erskine was now etched into the ledgers of the South London police force, but the man himself remained an enigma. In the sweltering July heat of 1986, the air in the incident room at Clapham was thick with the scent of stale coffee and the hum of electric fans. The palm prints from the windowsill had given them an identity, a history of petty thefts and burglaries, but they had not given them a location. To the authorities, Erskine was a ghost who drifted through the gaps of society. He had no fixed address, no phone number, and no family who claimed him. He was a creature of the margins, a shadow that moved between the high-rise estates and the crumbling squats of Brixton. The detectives looked at his mugshot, seeing a young man of 24 years, and tried to reconcile the quiet, unremarkable face in the photograph with the savage brutality visited upon the elderly residents of Stockwell. As the investigation deepened, the police began to map out the geography of a drifter. They focused their efforts on the places where a man with no home might find refuge. They visited the sprawling, makeshift settlements known as Cardboard City, where the disenfranchised huddled beneath the arches of Waterloo. They moved through the grim, overcrowded hostels where the air smelled of damp wool and industrial cleaner. In every location, the story was the same. People remembered a quiet man, someone who kept his head down and his hood up. He was often seen with the telltale signs of solvent abuse, including the glazed look in the eyes and the chemical tang of glue clinging to his clothes. He was a man who lived on the very edge of visibility, making him nearly impossible to track in a city of millions. Then, a witness came forward who had seen the face behind the shadow. On a humid night in late July, just after the murder of Florence Tisdall, a young woman named Denise Keena had been walking across Putney Bridge. The time was roughly 11:30 at night. She described an encounter that had chilled her to the bone long before she knew a killer was on the loose. A man had approached her, his presence radiating an intense, chaotic energy. She told the police that his face was a mask of terrifying intensity. His eyes were wide and staring, and his mouth was open in a silent, jagged grin. The muscles and tendons in his neck were pulled tight against his skin, as if he were vibrating with an internal pressure he could barely contain. To Denise, he did not look like a petty burglar. He looked like a man possessed by a darkness that was beginning to overflow. This was the first time the police realized that their suspect was not just hiding, he was unraveling. Despite his apparent instability, Erskine possessed a strange and calculating duality. While he wandered the streets as a homeless drifter, he was quietly managing a secret financial life that baffled the investigators. When they looked into his records, they discovered that this man, who claimed unemployment benefits every week, had opened 10 different bank and building society accounts across the city. Into these accounts, He had deposited nearly £3,000, which was a significant sum in 1986. It was the profit of his crimes, the harvested savings of the vulnerable people he had preyed upon. He would kill for a few crumpled notes, and then, with a chilling calmness, walk into a high-street bank to deposit his blood-soaked earnings. This juxtaposition of the ragged drifter and the disciplined launderer of stolen cash made him all the more elusive to those trying to predict his next move. The search eventually led the police to a gray, utilitarian building known as Keyworth House. This was the local Social Security office where Erskine was a regular visitor. The staff there knew him well, but they did not know him as a monster. They called him the Whisperer. To them, he was a timid, soft-spoken young man who barely raised his voice above a breathy mutter. He would stand patiently in line, his eyes fixed on the floor, waiting for his weekly allowance. There was no trace of the wild-eyed predator Denise Keena had seen on the bridge. This was his camouflage, a cloak of perceived weakness that allowed him to move through the heart of the community without raising a single alarm. The detectives realized that if they were to catch him, they would have to wait for him to step back into the light of the bureaucracy he so quietly relied upon. Plans were drafted for a massive stakeout. More than 100 officers were involved in the operation, fanning out across the various points where Erskine might appear. They watched the squats in Brixton, where the windows were boarded with plywood and the hallways were littered with debris. They sat in unmarked cars outside the hostels, watching every hooded figure that passed by in the twilight. The tension in the force was palpable. They knew that with every passing day, the risk of another attack grew. The Strangler of Stockwell was no longer just a headline. He was a living, breathing person with a name and a routine. The faceless drifter had finally been given a face, and now the city held its breath as the police prepared to close the circle around him in the flickering heat of the London summer. London in July 1986 felt like it was standing entirely still. The heat wave had settled over the city like a heavy, dusty blanket, pressing down on the asphalt until it softened under the weight of the summer sun. In Southwark, the air was thick with the scent of hot exhaust and the distant, rhythmic hum of a metropolis trying to catch its breath. For weeks, the city had been gripped by a different kind of fever, a creeping fear that lived in the shadows of bedroom windows and behind double-locked doors. But inside the Department of Social Security office at Keyworth House, the world seemed mundane, even tedious. The tension of the streets was replaced by the slow, bureaucratic pulse of paper and ink. The interior of the office was a sea of gray linoleum and yellowing paper. Electric fans whirred on desktops, uselessly pushing the humid air from one corner to another in a lazy, hypnotic cycle. People stood in a long, winding line, shifting their weight from foot to foot, clutching tattered forms and plastic identification cards. It was Monday, July 28, 1986. To the staff at Keyworth House, this was just another morning of processing claims and verifying the endless details of survival. They were used to the regulars, the drifters, and the quiet souls who moved through the system like ghosts. Among these regulars was a man they had nicknamed the Whisperer, a figure so unassuming that he seemed to blend into the very walls of the building. The Whisperer was a 24-year-old man named Kenneth Erskine. He was a familiar face to the clerks, though one that never quite left an impression of strength or menace. He was slight, wiry, and carried a quiet, timid energy that made him seem much smaller than his physical stature. He had been coming to this specific office since 1984 to claim his unemployment benefits, always appearing precisely when expected. When he spoke, his voice was a barely audible rasp, a sound so soft that it necessitated leaning in close just to catch a single word. The staff knew him as a harmless, if eccentric, character who simply wanted his due. They had no way of knowing that the hands resting calmly on the counter were the same hands that had brought a violent, suffocating end to the lives of 7 elderly people. Outside the office, and scattered discreetly among the genuine claimants, the atmosphere was far from mundane. The massive police operation, which had seen more than 100 officers fanning out across the city, was now narrowing its focus to this single, stifling room. Detectives had finally found the breakthrough they needed when a palm print from a crime scene was matched to a man with a prior record for burglary. They knew Erskine would be coming to collect his check, and they had prepared the trap with silent precision. Plainclothes detectives sat on the hard plastic chairs, pretending to read folded newspapers or check their watches with practiced boredom. Their eyes, however, never stopped moving, constantly flicking toward the glass entrance doors every time they swung open. The door opened once more, and a draft of hot street air followed a new figure inside. Kenneth Erskine walked in, moving with a strange, aimless grace. He looked disheveled, a man who clearly lived on the fringes of society, perhaps entirely unaware that the net had already closed around him. He took his place in the queue, his presence unremarkable to the other people waiting for their benefits. As the line moved forward with agonizing slowness, the ticking of the large wall clock seemed to grow louder. It was a heavy thud of plastic and gears that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the officers watching from the corners. The clerk at the window looked up, saw the familiar, hollow-eyed face of the whisperer, and began the routine process of checking his records. The moment the clerk gave the prearranged signal, the stillness of the room shattered. It was not a loud, dramatic raid with shouting and sirens, but a swift and surgical movement of several men at once. Before Erskine could even realize the gravity of his situation, the detectives were upon him. One grabbed his left arm, another moved to block any possible exit, and the sharp, metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the small, crowded space. The other claimants gasped in shock, some backing away in confusion as they realized the man standing next to them was being taken into custody. But Erskine himself did not fight. He did not shout, nor did he struggle. He stood there, limp and oddly silent, as the grip of the law finally took hold of the man who had haunted the city for months. As he was led out of Keyworth House and toward a waiting, unmarked police car, the oppressive heat of London seemed to break, if only for a fleeting second. The reign of the Stockwell Strangler had ended in the most ordinary of places, over a routine paperwork check in a crowded government office. He was driven away to Clapham Police Station, leaving behind a room full of people who had stood mere inches away from a predator, without ever realizing the danger. The investigation was far from over, as the focus now shifted from the frantic hunt to the grueling interrogation. But for the first time in the long summer of 1986, the elderly of South London could finally close their eyes and breathe a little easier in the dark. The heavy, iron-scented air of the station swallowed them as they transitioned from the midday glare into the long shadows of the precinct. Kenneth Erskine walked with a strange, compliant passivity, his wrists bound in steel that caught the flickers of overhead fluorescent tubes. There was no struggle, no defiant shout, only the rhythmic, hollow shuffle of his feet on the linoleum floors. To the officers flanking him, he felt less like a captured predator and more like a ghost being led through a maze of his own making. The oppressive heat of 1986 followed them inside, clinging to their wool suits like a damp weight, but within the thick stone walls of the station, a different kind of coldness began to take root. They led him down a narrow, yellowed corridor, where the sounds of distant typewriters and ringing telephones were muffled by the dense, painted brick, creating a silence that felt heavy and expectant. The door to the interrogation room opened with a low, weighted groan, revealing a space designed to be both intimate and claustrophobic. A single wooden table sat in the center, its surface scarred with the cigarette burns and ink stains of 1,000 previous interviews. 2 chairs faced one another like silent opponents in a game with no rules. There was a window, positioned high up and narrow, offering only a sliver of the gray London sky and the tops of distant, soot-stained chimneys. As Kenneth sat, the detectives noticed the physical presence of the man. The faint, acrid scent of industrial solvents and the stale musk of a life lived in the damp, unlit corners of the city. He did not look at the men across from him. Instead, his gaze drifted upward to the corner of the ceiling, following a jagged crack in the plaster as if it were a secret map to another world. The silence in the room was thick, broken only by the low hum of the ventilation and the steady, mechanical ticking of the wall clock. Detective Chief Inspector John Bassett sat across from the suspect, opening a manila folder with a slow, deliberate rustle of paper. He watched the man the staff at the Social Security office had nicknamed the Whisperer. Erskine's voice, when it finally broke the silence, was so soft it barely registered on the air. It was a timid, high-pitched sound that seemed entirely at odds with the brutal violence that had terrorized the housing estates of North and South London. He spoke in fragments, his words drifting like smoke through the air, never quite landing on a solid truth. When asked about his whereabouts on those humid nights in April and June, he simply stared through the detectives. There was a profound vacancy in his dark eyes that was more disturbing than any flash of anger could have ever been. The detectives had spent their careers dealing with hardened criminals and desperate men, but there was something fundamentally unmoored in the way Kenneth occupied the space. He was not hiding behind a lie. He was simply existing in a different reality altogether. As the hours stretched deep into the evening, the interrogation took on a surreal, almost hypnotic quality that tested the patience of the veteran officers. The detectives began to notice the strange, jarring inversions of his body language. When asked a direct question about the evidence found at the crime scenes, Kenneth would nod his head slowly while whispering the word no. When he seemed to agree with a statement, he would shake his head from side to side in a rhythmic motion of denial. It was a localized, private language of contradiction that forced the officers to slow their pace to a crawl, questioning every gesture as if they were learning a new and alien dialect. Periodically, he would break into a sudden, high-pitched giggle that had no visible catalyst, the sound bouncing off the bare walls and settling uncomfortably in the chests of the men listening. It was the laugh of a young child, yet it emerged from the throat of a man accused of the most adult of cruelties. There were moments when Kenneth would lose interest in the conversation entirely, his mind drifting away from the sterile room. His eyes would fixate on the narrow window, watching the shift of light as the London sun began to dip below the horizon and the shadows lengthened across the floor. He seemed genuinely fascinated by the movement of the clouds, his lips moving in a silent, internal dialogue that no one else could hear. At one point, he began to rock back and forth in the plastic chair, a rhythmic, self-soothing motion that seemed to insulate him from the gravity of the accusations being leveled against him. Most disturbing to the officers were his sudden lapses into repetitive physical compulsions, acts that seemed designed to fill the silence or perhaps to ward off the reality of his situation. The detectives tried to pull him back, presenting him with photographs of the quiet streets and the victims' homes, but he looked at them with the detached, glassy curiosity of a stranger viewing a series of postcards. The detectives exchanged weary, frustrated glances in the dimming light of the small room. They were beginning to realize that they were not just questioning a suspect, but were instead navigating the fractured, uneven landscape of a mind that had seemingly stopped growing long ago. Psychiatrists would later estimate that while his body was that of a 24-year-old, his mental age was closer to that of a 12-year-old boy. Yet, the physical evidence, the palm prints left with clinical precision on the windowsills of the deceased, told a story of calculated entry and immense physical strength. This duality was the true, lingering horror of the man sitting in the room. He was a whisperer who could become a shadow, a daydreamer who left a trail of waking nightmares in the beds of the most vulnerable. As the tape recorder eventually clicked to a stop, the room felt smaller and colder than before, haunted by the realization that the most dangerous presence is often the one that cannot even comprehend the magnitude of its own darkness. The morning air outside the Old Bailey on the 12th of January, 1988, was biting and sharp, a stark contrast to the heavy, stagnant atmosphere inside the Central Criminal Court. For months, the city had held its breath, waiting for the moment when the man accused of terrorizing London's most vulnerable citizens would finally face justice. As the doors to the courtroom creaked open, the smell of old wood and cold stone seemed to settle over the gallery. This was a place where history was measured in shadows and echoes, and today, the shadow of Kenneth Erskine loomed larger than most. The gallery was packed with journalists and a few somber relatives of the victims, their faces etched with a weary kind of hope. In the dock sat Erskine, a 24-year-old man who looked remarkably ordinary for someone accused of such extraordinary cruelty. He was a thin, lanky figure, appearing almost swallowed by his surroundings. There was a peculiar detachment in his eyes, a vacant stare that suggested he was drifting somewhere far away from the gravity of the charges against him. As the prosecution began to lay out the case, the courtroom was plunged into a dark narrative of the summer of 1986. The details were presented with a clinical, slow-burning precision. The court heard how the killer had moved like a ghost through the suburbs of South London, slipping through unsecured windows in the dead of night. The prosecution described a chillingly consistent method. In each case, the attacker would kneel upon the chests of his elderly victims, pinning them down with his full weight. He would place his left hand firmly over their mouths to stifle any cries for help, while his right hand would tighten around their throats. The silence in the courtroom was absolute as these physical details were read aloud. It was a methodology of absolute control and predatory focus, targeting those who had the least power to resist. Erskine, however, seemed almost bored. At several points during the testimony, he was seen to nod off, his head dipping toward his chest as if the life-and-death struggle being described was merely background noise. Then came the forensic evidence, the silent, undeniable witnesses of the crime scenes. The prosecution focused heavily on the palm prints. In the world of 1988, forensic science was beginning to assert a new kind of dominance in the courtroom. Experts stood before the jury and explained how a palm print found on a displaced plant pot at the home of Janet Cockett provided a direct link to the man in the dock. Another print, lifted from a kitchen wall in the home of William Downs, served as a ghostly signature left behind in the heat of the moment. These were not just smears of oil and skin. They were permanent markers of presence. The jury leaned in, examining the enlarged photographs of the ridges and whorls that matched Erskine's hands perfectly. Beyond the prints, there were the shoe imprints. Forensic teams had found distinct marks at 3 different crime scenes, including the location of a brutal double murder. When Erskine was arrested, a pair of shoes found in his possession were found to match those imprints in every detail, from the wear on the heels to the specific tread pattern. The trial moved into the financial movements of a man who claimed to be a penniless drifter. The prosecution presented Erskine's building society records, a paper trail that spoke of a sudden and grisly prosperity. During the 3 months of the killing spree, this man, who was officially collecting unemployment benefits, had deposited nearly £3,000 into various accounts. On the morning after the murder of 82-year-old William Carman, Erskine had walked into a bank and deposited £300 in cash. It was well known that Mr. Carman had kept roughly £400 in his bedroom, money that vanished the night he was killed. The coincidence was too sharp to be ignored. The jury watched as the numbers were displayed, representing the literal price of a human life. Each deposit seemed to anchor Erskine more firmly to the scenes of the crimes, transforming him from a wandering vagrant into a calculated predator who profited from his violence. Perhaps the most emotional moment of the trial came when Frederick Prentice took the stand. At 73 years old, he was the only one who had looked into the eyes of the strangler and lived to tell the tale. He entered the courtroom on a mobility scooter, a small but resilient figure against the backdrop of the high ceilings. He spoke with a quiet, trembling courage, describing the moment he woke up in the darkness to find a man sitting on his chest, hands reaching for his throat. He told the court how he had managed to trigger an alarm, scaring the intruder away. When asked to look around the room and identify his attacker, he pointed directly at Kenneth Erskine. The recognition was instantaneous and chilling. In that moment, the abstract evidence of prints and bank books became secondary to the lived reality of a survivor. The jury was visibly moved, some members turning their heads away from the defendant, unable to reconcile his vacant expression with the terror described by the old man on the stand. The deliberations did not last as long as many expected. On the 29th of January, 1988, the jury returned to the box. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, the kind of silence that feels heavy against the skin. One by one, the clerk of the court read out the charges. 7 counts of murder, 1 count of attempted murder. For each count, the foreman of the jury uttered the same word, guilty. Erskine remained largely unmoved, his expression flickering only slightly as the weight of 7 life sentences was placed upon his shoulders. The judge, in a voice that carried the full authority of the law, recommended that Erskine serve a minimum of 40 years in prison. At the time, it was the longest period of detention ever recommended in British legal history. It was a sentence meant to ensure that the man known as the Stockwell Strangler would never again walk the streets he had once turned into a hunting ground. As the guards led him away, a collective breath was finally released. The terror of 1986 was officially over, though the scars on the community would remain for generations. The echoes of the courtroom's heavy doors seemed to vibrate in the air long after the trial had concluded. In January of 1988, when Kenneth Erskine was led away to begin 7 concurrent life sentences, the public felt a collective sense of relief. The monster of Stockwell was finally behind bars, a shadow removed from the sun-drenched estates of South London. But for Erskine, the end of the trial was merely the beginning of a much longer, quieter journey. He was no longer a headline or a face on a wanted poster. He was a prisoner, numbered and categorized. Yet, as he was moved from the high-security confines of the prison system, it became increasingly clear that the man the press called the Strangler was a person deeply fractured by a reality none of us could truly perceive. The transition from the steel and concrete of a standard cell toward the red-brick Victorian clinical landscape of Broadmoor Hospital was a pivot that would eventually rewrite his entire legal history. Broadmoor Hospital sits atop a ridge in Crowthorne, Berkshire, surrounded by dense pine forests and a hauntingly beautiful silence. Built in the mid-19th century as the criminal lunatic asylum, its architecture is a blend of grand Victorian ambition and the somber necessity of containment. Here, the air is thick with the weight of history. For Kenneth Erskine, this became his world shortly after his conviction. Inside these walls, the sensory experience shifts. There is the persistent hum of distant ventilation, the rhythmic jingle of keys against heavy belts, and the soft, shuffling footsteps of patients in the corridors. Erskine, often referred to as the Whisperer by those who encountered him because of his timid, low-pitched voice, began a life of medical observation. The investigators had seen him as a predator, but the doctors began to see a man lost in a profound, chronic mental fog. The vibrant, terrifying energy of the 1986 killings had faded into a slow, medicated routine under the watchful eyes of the psychiatric staff. In the decades that followed, the name Kenneth Erskine surfaced only rarely in the news, often in the most bizarre of circumstances. One such moment occurred on the 23rd of February, 1996. Deep within the Henley ward of Broadmoor, a violent struggle broke out between two of the facility's most notorious residents. Another inmate had launched a brutal attack on Peter Sutcliffe, the man known as the Yorkshire Ripper, attempting to strangle him with a stereo headphone cable. In a strange twist of fate, it was Erskine who intervened. The man who had taken so many lives through strangulation became the one to stop it, raising the alarm and physically stepping in to save a fellow killer. It was a surreal intersection of criminal history, a moment where the lines of victim and perpetrator blurred within the confined ecosystem of the hospital. This incident served as a reminder that behind the high walls, a complex, high-stakes society existed, one governed by medication, therapy, and the unpredictable nature of severe mental illness. As the years stretched into decades, the medical understanding of Erskine's condition deepened. While the jury in 1988 had seen a cold-blooded murderer, subsequent psychiatric evaluations over 20 years painted a different picture. Doctors like Andrew Horn, who observed Erskine for more than 20 years, noted that his schizophrenia was not a recent development. It was a chronic, debilitating condition that had likely been present as far back as 1980. The legal system began to grapple with a difficult question. Could a man so fundamentally detached from reality be held fully responsible for his actions? By the time the mid-2000s arrived, the groundwork was being laid for a massive legal challenge. The silence of his incarceration was about to be broken by a return to the royal courts of justice, though this time the focus would not be on his guilt, but on the very nature of his mind. The turning point arrived in July of 2009. The Court of Appeal gathered to hear fresh medical evidence that had been gathered since the original trial. It was a somber proceeding, focused on the nuances of diminished responsibility. The defense argued that at the time of the 1986 murders, Erskine was suffering from an abnormality of mind so severe that it substantially impaired his mental responsibility. The Lord Chief Justice, Lord Judge, listened to the testimonies of multiple experts who all reached the same conclusion. Erskine had been profoundly ill during his crime spree. This realization did not diminish the horror of what had happened to those 7 elderly victims in Stockwell and beyond, but it shifted the legal framework of the case. The court acknowledged that the original murder convictions were, in light of this modern medical consensus, legally unsafe. The atmosphere in the courtroom was clinical, yet the weight of the 7 lives lost still hung heavily in the air as the judges prepared their ruling. On the 14th of July, 2009, the decision was finalized. The 7 murder convictions were quashed and replaced with 7 counts of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. It was a rare and significant moment in British legal history. The court replaced his life sentences with an indefinite hospital order under the Mental Health Act. Lord Judge made it clear that while the label of the crime had changed, the threat to the public remained a paramount concern. Erskine would not be walking free. He would remain a patient, potentially for the rest of his life. This legal shift was a victory for psychiatric medicine, acknowledging that the symptoms of severe schizophrenia, the delusions and the cognitive decay, could drive a person to commit acts of unthinkable violence. For the families of the victims, however, the change in terminology brought little comfort. The loss of Nancy Ems, Janet Crockett, and the others remained a permanent scar, regardless of whether it was called murder or manslaughter. The final transition for the man once known as the Stockwell Strangler occurred in 2016. After decades in the high-security environment of Broadmoor, Erskine's risk status was eventually downgraded. He was moved to Thornford Park, a medium-security psychiatric hospital in Berkshire. This move represented a quiet closing of a circle. The once feared predator, who had terrorized London in the scorching summer of 1986, had become an aging man existing within a world of therapeutic schedules and supervised walks. The fear he had instilled in the elderly residents of Stockwell had become a part of local legend, a dark story told in hushed tones. Now, as he resides in the quiet of a medium-security ward, the legal and medical battles have reached their conclusion. The case of Kenneth Erskine remains a haunting study of the thin, often blurred line between pure malice and a mind shattered by illness. He remains there still, a silent figure in the long, cooling shadows of the past. As we reach the final clearing of this story, the city of London seems to hold its breath. In the modern neighborhood of Stockwell, the red brick estates and the leafy squares have settled into a quiet, suburban rhythm. The frantic headlines of 1986 have yellowed in the archives, and the heavy iron bolts that once adorned every door have, for many, become a forgotten precaution. But in the soft architecture of memory, the echoes of that summer still linger like a distant fog. To understand the impact of the man once known as the Stockwell Strangler, we must move past the fear and look closely at the lives that were so abruptly interrupted. They were not just names in a ledger. They were the pillars of their community, the keepers of history, and the quiet souls who sought nothing more than the comfort of their own homes as the sun set over the Thames. Think of Eileen Ems, 78 years of age. She was a retired schoolteacher who lived in a basement flat in Wandsworth. Imagine the smell of old paper and the soft ticking of a mantel clock that filled her rooms. She had spent her life guiding young minds, a woman of patience and order. When she was found in April of that year, the world didn't yet know a predator was among them. Then there was Janet Cockett, 67, who lived on the Wandsworth housing estate. She was a woman of action, the chairwoman of the local tenants association. She was the one who looked out for everyone else, the one who made sure the neighborhood was cared for. Her loss left a void in the social fabric of the street, a silence where there used to be a steady, guiding voice. These women were the anchors of their worlds, and their absence was felt in every empty seat and every unanswered knock at the door. Inside the residential homes of Stockwell, we find the stories of Valentine Gleim and Zbigniew Strabawa. Valentine was 84, and Zbigniew was 94. Their lives were extraordinary tapestries of survival. Zbigniew had fled the unimaginable horrors of Poland during the Second World War, escaping the grasp of the Nazis to find a peaceful life in England. He had survived the darkest chapter of the 20th century, only to have his long life ended in the one place that should have been his ultimate sanctuary. There is a profound, heavy irony in that truth. These men had seen the world change, had seen empires fall and rise, and in their final years, they deserved a quiet dignity. The community felt the weight of this loss deeply, a sense that a library of lived experience had been burned down in a single, senseless night. The pattern continued through the heat of July. William Carman, 84, lived in Islington. In his flat, a chilling detail was found that still haunts the retelling of this case. His family photographs had been turned to the wall. It was as if the intruder could not bear the silent gaze of his victims' loved ones. William Downs, 74, lived in a simple bedsit in Stockwell. He was a man of modest means, a man who moved through the world without causing a ripple. The amounts of money stolen were often small, £30 here, £300 there. But the true theft was the peace of mind of every elderly person in South London. For a time, the simple act of leaving a bathroom window ajar for a summer breeze became an invitation to terror. The neighborhood changed. It became inward-facing, suspicious, and heavy with the scent of fear. The final victim, Florence Tisdall, was 83. She lived in a retirement complex in Fulham, a place of safety near Putney Bridge. On the day before she was taken, she had joined millions of others in watching the televised wedding of Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson. She had even gone to the hairdresser to have her hair done specially for the occasion, wanting to feel part of the national celebration. It is a heartbreaking image, an elderly woman, sitting in her favorite chair, still carrying the glow of a festive day, completely unaware that the shadows were closing in. Her death was the final catalyst that broke the case open, leading the police to the drifter they called the Whisperer. Kenneth Erskine was a man of quiet voices and deep, internal fractures, a man whose mind was a labyrinth of schizophrenia that the courts would struggle to define for decades to come. In 2009, the legal system finally reconciled with the medical reality of the man in Broadmoor. The 7 counts of murder were reduced to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. The world had moved on, but for the families of the 7, the change in terminology mattered far less than the enduring fact of their absence. Today, the high walls of the hospital hold the man who once haunted the night, and the streets of Stockwell have reclaimed their light. The fear has faded, replaced by the resilience of a community that refused to be defined by a single summer of darkness. We remember the school teachers, the veterans, and the grandmothers not for how they left us, but for the light they carried during their many decades on this earth. The shadows are gone now, and the air is clear. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.